Hey there, it is Mr. K. Welcome back to the next AP Lit lecture. And I said this on the last lecture, but I just want to say it again. Forgive me in advance. I have a bit of a cold, so I may be uh, pausing the video every once in a while and coughing or sneezing and then coming right back. But it won't affect you or the lecture, but just if it's a little choppy sometimes, it's because I don't want to just sneeze in your face. Okay, so this is actually our last lecture for Unit 1. And so if you've been following the lectures, then you have finished the first of 9 units that CollegeBoard gives us. And so well done on that. And if you're one of my students, then we've definitely been following this progression, and we have come to the end of the first unit. So that's great. So we are finishing up by completing this idea, developing a defensible claim about an interpretation of a text. This lesson specifically is going to help us develop a claim about the third-person point of view in a short piece of fiction, gather evidence to support the claim, and write an insightful paragraph to defend it. And so, really, at the end of Unit 1, we're not getting into writing essays yet. We're not there. We are just trying to remind ourselves of a couple things in literature that are important to look for, namely, our character and our setting and our structure and narrator and figurative language and things like that. And taking those ideas, gathering evidence about it, coming up with a claim, supporting that claim, and in doing so in a paragraph. And so, if we can go from an excerpt of literature, of fiction, and end with a paragraph that is defensible and has evidence and is insightful, then we're really in good shape. Because from there, it's all about kind of building on that and writing 2 or 3 of those paragraphs, you know what I mean, and putting an essay together. But really, right now, that's where we are. That's what we're trying to do. So we're going to review the key ideas today about claims and evidence, and we need to understand how to incorporate quotes into our paragraphs. And so we're going to look at examples of that. Finally, understand how to transition from one idea to another. And I will give you a couple different ways to think through that, the transitioning from one idea to the next. But those are our goals for today. All right. So we're really just going to jump in here. Let's imagine that we are being asked to write about this question at the top in the box. How does the point of view help to establish the beginning of the story in Shirley Jackson's The Lottery? Again, at this point, we've talked about being able to identify the point of view in the lottery. That's great, but that's only really one part of it. We really need to get to the point where we can answer this question: how does the point of view actually function? And in this case, with this question in the box, how does it establish the beginning of the story? What is it actually? What is it actually doing? And we need to be able to talk about that and write about that clearly and powerfully and thoroughly, right? So let me read the excerpt. If you haven't read this whole story, that's okay. You will still be able to talk about this without reading the story. I do suggest reading the story because it's phenomenal, and it's a short read as well. So we really have no excuse not to read it. But it's okay if you haven't. It's totally okay. Okay, so here we go. The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. She writes this. Soon the men began to gather, surveying their own children, speaking of planting and rain, tractors and taxes. They stood together, away from the pile of stones in the corner, and their jokes were quiet, and they smiled rather than laughed. The women, wearing faded house dresses and sweaters, came shortly after their menfolk. They greeted one another and exchanged bits of gossip as they went to join their husbands. Soon the women, standing by their husbands, began to call to their children, and the children came reluctantly, having to be called 4 or 5 times. Bobby Martin ducked under his mother's grasping hand and ran, laughing, back to the pile of stones. His father spoke up sharply, and Bobby came quickly and took his place between his father and his oldest brother. All right. Now, yes, of course, it would be very helpful if you have read the story in its entirety, to be able to write an essay. But again, for today's purposes, how can we, within this excerpt, within the context of just this excerpt, how can we write about the point of view and how it establishes the story? Okay, here are some ideas from past lectures. Uh, Hopefully, we're able to pick up on the fact that this is a third person, objective point of view. All right. And so, third person meaning the narrator is not in the story, is not within the frame of the story, is looking in on it, but doesn't really reveal any um, inner thoughts, inner feelings of characters. We just see kind of outward actions, right? I would say the closest we get to it is, I thought there was the word apprehension in here. Oh no, reluctance. Yeah, reluctance. Um, the reluctance there, we only know that the children are reluctant because they are moving uh, towards their parents reluctantly. They had to be called 4 or 5 times. So again, our narrator is seeing things happen, but can't see within the thoughts and feelings of the characters. It's really just seeing events unfold. Right? We have quotes like this. They greeted one another and exchanged bits of gossip as they went to join their husbands. Okay. They stood together away from the pile of stones in the corner, and their jokes were quiet, and they smiled rather than laughed. And finally, soon the women standing by their husbands began to call to their children, and the children came reluctantly, having to be called 4 or 5 times. Okay. Um, Something weird is happening, right? Like in this scene, we may not know exactly what, if we haven't read the story as of yet, but we're picking up on just some weird vibes. Um, Everyone is joking quietly. They smile, but they don't laugh. Um, the women exchange bits of gossip, and then they go to join their husbands. There's a social component to whatever they're doing, but it's not like a big kind of barbecue. Like they're like gossiping a little bit, very reluctantly, very uh, apprehensively, and then going back to their husbands. And then the women are standing by their husbands. They call the kids, and the kids come reluctantly, having to be called 4 or 5 times. It's just eerie to me, right? And again, maybe knowing the story certainly plays into that. But gosh, my curtain is driving me crazy. I'm so sorry. Um, Hopefully, when you're reading even just that excerpt, you're picking up on some of that. But here's a claim. Okay, so we're answering now this question at the top. How does the point of view help to establish the beginning of the story in Shirley Jackson's The Lottery? Okay, here's a claim. In Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, the narrator is distant and detached from the events of the story. This third person objective point of view allows the narrator to stay removed from the events while building suspense and intrigue about the characters. Really great claim, right? It's true. It's provable. There's evidence in the text that would you could latch on to any of these ideas. Is the narrator distant and detached? Certainly. How do we know? Well, the narrator says this or points this out, or is not able to point this out. They are removed from the events, and it does build suspense and intrigue. We're uh, because of the narrator and the narrator's relationship to us, the readers, we are wondering what is going on here. This is so weird. This is so strange. And I want answers. So great claim. Great claim. Now, let's add to that. So notice the paragraph, the sentence that is not highlighted is what I just read to you. That's our claim. Now, what do we do next? Students ask me this all the time, Mr. K. What do I write next? Where do I go next? Right? And so, well, let me show you. After you write a claim like that, the next natural step is to include evidence. And I mentioned this a bit in the last lecture, but now we really get to see these pieces. Come together. So the yellow highlighted is evidence from the text, and the evidence can be quoted, it can be paraphrased, it can be summarized. Any of that is fair game. But let me read the evidence part to you. So it says this. This distance is not only evident in the use of the pronoun they, it is also revealed through the narrator's tone. Quote, they greeted one another and exchanged bits of gossip as they went to join their husbands. In this example, the greeting is not characterized, nor do we learn anything about the bits of gossip. The tone of this sentence is neutral, perhaps even cautious. Great. Using specific evidence from the text as proof of the original claim, the first sentence. The only thing I would add to this example is I would not want a student to put a quote like this. They greeted one another and exchanged bits of gossip as they went to join their husbands. I never want it just kind of dropped in by itself. You see, there's nothing before or after it. Even something simple in the beginning of this sentence like Jackson writes, or we are told that, quote, they greeted one another. Just something to embed that evidence, right? But overall, we have a nice claim. It's strong. It's defensible. It goes it goes deeper than just the surface level, and it's proven, with this evidence. Now, where do we go next after this? Let me show you. So, the highlighted bit is what is now being added. When we learn that, quote, they stood together away from the pile of stones in the corner and their jokes were quiet and they smiled rather than laughed, we gain no insight as to why the stones seem important, even though they are. Why they stood together, and why they smiled instead of laughed. Notice, taking a piece of evidence that has, they stood together away from the stones, their jokes were quiet and they smiled rather than laughed. It's great. The writer, what they're doing is taking that evidence and mirroring that idea with their own writing. We gain no insight as to why the stones seem important, why they stood together, why they smiled instead of laughed. 3 for 3. 3 comments for 3 kind of pieces of this evidence. It's got a nice rhythm to it. It's got a nice feel to it. And notice any time that a new section starts with highlight. So we learned that, quote, they stood together. It is referring directly to the text itself, and it builds on the previous sentence's idea, or few sentences, plural, idea. Right? When we added this one, the second kind of move that we made, this distance is not only evident in et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That comes from this distance, right, that is referred to in the first sentence. It's stepping stones. I'm talking about this. And, while I'm talking about this, let me tell you about this. And also about that, here's why that's interesting. You know what I mean? And you're just putting, stone after stone after stone so you can walk across, right? Okay, so here's the last part, I believe. Yeah. Here's the last part of this paragraph. So in doing so, kind of wrapping it up, the third person objective narrator, referring back to our claim. Why is the third person narrator, what is the function? In doing so, this third-person objective narrator is building suspense and intrigue as the reader craves to know more about these unnamed characters, their thoughts, and the reasons behind their actions. It really comes down to making a claim, providing evidence, commenting on that evidence. Claim, evidence. In the past, I've said claim, evidence, warrant. A lot of the materials that I'm seeing in CollegeBoard now is your claim, evidence, commentary. Sometimes you'll hear it you'll hear terms like the reason or the reasoning. But basically, you make a point, you provide evidence for that point, you explain that evidence. 1, 2, 3. You do those 3 steps, and you got yourself a paragraph. Just to look at the movement of things. When you're planning, as a writer, when you're planning, we need to be looking for and collecting evidence. That's why I know they hate it, but I have students, when they're reading something, I want you to make any comments that you notice about character, structure, the narrator, figurative language, the plot, right? All of that. Anything that you notice, just collecting evidence. And then you use that evidence to form ideas. And then you use those ideas to form a claim, right? And then in the writing process, you take that claim, you use that claim, or through that claim, you break down the ideas. And how do you break down the ideas? You provide evidence for that, right? And so the planning process and the writing process are like working together. It's yin and yang, and they feed off of one another, And a lot of times you'll find this as a writer. You could be at the end of an essay, and you're still, especially on like an AP Lang exam or an AP Lit exam or something like that. You're at the end of an essay, and you're like, I'm still kind of planning here. I'm just going to make it happen as I go. So that planning process happens even while you're writing, right? But those are the processes in motion. That's how you move from reading something to actually saying something, and that's what we're going for. So the goals today are those exact ideas, actually. We want to review key ideas about claims and evidence. What are they? Understand how to incorporate quotes into your paragraphs. So we saw several examples of those. And we need to understand how to transition from one idea to another. Again, building on the previous sentence or a previous idea, furthering the point. Ask yourself, okay, what's next? Okay, I finished this idea, or I finished this sentence. Okay, what's next? What's the next natural thing that I need to say? And one thing I will say that tends to be different from some English teachers, and that's okay. Transition statements are important. They're important to know. They're certainly important to pick up on as a reader. But you also, if we looked at the paragraph that we just had, there really wasn't a lot of there wasn't any first, second, finally, it's just so juvenile, you want to make it just sound natural, and to say, not only this idea, but this idea. That in and of itself is fine. But if you do that every single sentence, it might be a little much, right? And so that's what we're trying to do, is transition from one idea to the next without having to rely super heavily on middle school level kind of transition statements. But okay, those are the goals for today, my friends. With that, hopefully you feel prepared to read something, begin to break it down, and start to speak about it. As usual, if you ever need any or if you have any questions or need any additional help or whatever, you can email me. My email address is on the YouTube channel. All right. Thanks. I'll see you next time.